I'm Melissa Harris-Perry. Thank you so much for joining our first session here, which is one of our breakout sessions. We are going to take up a conversation. I want to tell you just a little bit about the Rethinking Community Conference approach to these conversations. Just so you know, each and every one of the concurrent sessions, Provost Kirsch, please feel free to take a seat down front. Even if you have to run out, we will not take it as a free speech walkout. If you are running out to various sessions, we know you may be visiting multiple sessions. You'll notice that each of our conversations is framed with an and instead of a versus. Just so you know, that is because our goal here is not to use a debate format, although we have encouraged all of our conversation partners to take strong positions. And given what we had at dinner last night, we have no worries that our conversation partners are undoubtedly going to take strong positions. We are going to begin with a conversation that has become crucial across college campuses and certainly has been crucial everywhere in our country. This is the question of safe spaces and free speech. We even had a little bit of this in our opening plenary session. You'll know, just to note sort of what's happening in American politics and current events right now, that yesterday at the campus of the University of Florida, Richard Spencer, whose white supremacist organization was responsible for the two recent marches in Charlottesville, Virginia, also spoke on campus at the University of Florida, prompting again a whole set of questions about whether or not any of that constitutes some part of a free speech conversation. That came up for us as well last night at dinner. So I'm Melissa Harris-Perry. We are going to begin this conversation with 5 minutes, 5 to 7 minutes from each of our conversation partners talking about this framework, and then I'll pose really just probably one question and then allow our audience here to get in on the conversation. Our two conversation partners are Dr. Christina Greer. She is an associate professor of political science at the Fordham University Lincoln Center campus. You may have seen or may hear Dr. Greer. She does a lot of U.S. media work, including at WNYC in New York, and is a respected scholar whose conversations around American race and politics has really informed us over the course of the past 5 years. And Dr. Thomas Cushman, who is a professor of sociology at Wellesley College, whose center at Wellesley College actually does the work of often bringing speakers who help to provoke conversation on campus. I'm going to begin with Dr. Christina Greer.
Well, we drew straws before.
Oh, you did? All right. Yeah. No moderator privilege up in here. Go.
So
yes, let's do it. All right, we're going to begin with Dr. Thomas Cushman.
It was a fair contest.
Yes. Let's do it.
Okay, thank you for coming. It's nice to be here. You know, I've worked on a lot of difficult issues in my career, mainly human rights violations. Basically, I describe what I've done as looking at and trying to understand the worst things that human beings do to each other. And still, having studied and written mainly about the genocide in Bosnia, the free speech issue is still one that really vexes me in terms of its difficulty and its complexity. But I wanted to start with a personal story and actually be a little bit counterintuitive to the way the panel's set up and talk about safe spaces. And I'm going to be a little bit personal, which I don't often do in public, but I think it's important, being who I am, you know, phylogenetically and sociologically, you know, and what I look like, and to try to start off with saying something about safe spaces. My wife is a Bosnian Muslim who escaped from genocide in Bosnia after being under siege for 3 years. Got captured by a paramilitary organization, put in a camp, escaped, got put in the UN refugee camp, got to the United States, you know, and only in America, right? A Christian organization sponsored her to go to Sewanee University. And, you know, so she got dropped from, you know, genocide in Bosnia into rural Tennessee, speaking very little English. And the reason I'm telling this story is this. She looks a lot like me in terms of how she appears, you know, racially, eye color, hair color. And she, as a sociologist, when we travel together and go around in the world together, I listen to how people talk to her. And I was at a party once, and this is a prelude to what I'm going to say about free speech. It was in rural Virginia. It was a friend of a friend's friend or something like that. And this guy was pontificating about what the world needed. And he said to her, what we got to do first is kill all the Muslims. And she said, and you know, this is hate speech. This is actually harm speech. It's beyond just hate speech. It's speech that's threatening to kill Muslims. And she said, perhaps you'd like to start with me. And the look on his face was, you know, anthropologically, ethnographically priceless. You know, like, what do you mean? You can't be a Muslim. You have blue eyes and blonde hair. And the host took him out on the porch and was finger wagging him and, you know, giving him a lesson, you know. And we've talked for years subsequently about how to deal with people like that, how to deal with speech like that. During the election, she had become an American citizen just a few years before, and it had been her lifelong dream. I call her the perfect American. She loves the country. She emigrated here because she was in danger, like a lot of people, my own ancestors. What I experienced during the election period and subsequently is real fear on her part because of her ethnic status. And she's not religious at all. It was ethnic status. Most Bosnian Muslims were very secular. They were also the most cosmopolitan. If you had an argument in Bosnia, which is where I lived and studied for a while and wrote about, if a Serb and a Croat were having an argument and couldn't resolve it, they would find a Muslim to be the mediator because they were the most reasonable people in Sarajevo. You know, so I'm starting with this story to say I understand exactly what it might feel like. I can't precisely myself, but through this extension of myself, I can understand exactly what it might feel like to be a member of a group who has been historically targeted for oppression, marginalization, or in this case, death. And so the concept of safe space makes a lot of sociological sense to me. Philosophically and by nature, freedom of expression is, for me, a foundational value. As a human rights activist my entire life on various issues, as the editor of a journal of human rights, for me, the right of freedom of expression was always the most foundational right because it's the right from which all other rights claims follow. If you can't speak freely about your condition of oppression or marginalization or subordination, or you're just whatever you want to talk about, you can't make any other rights claims. And so this is why I very often talk about free speech to groups of people who have been historically marginalized or subordinated or oppressed or targeted for death or whatever, and try to tell them and persuade them, not lecture them, but try to persuade them why freedom of expression is really their best friend. And, you know, so the way it's shaking out on campuses these days is, and this kind of gets more, now is where I'll get more into what I really came to talk about. I've been doing a study of university administrators and their speeches and their written words. I have a collection of about 250 articles, op-eds, speeches, email publications to the communities, and I'm analyzing the rhetoric of it. And in these speeches, the administrators say something like this: freedom of expression is the foundation of a liberal arts education and must be protected. At the same time, we are also deeply committed to the values of diversity, equity, and inclusion. Okay, so you have 4 values there. I'm kind of putting freedom of expression on one side and diversity and equity and inclusion on the other side because they make that polarization, they make that polarity. And so I thought to myself, you know, rhetorically, it's easy to do that. It's easy to say, yeah, I'm for free speech. Why not? You know, it makes us free. It gives us human rights, other human rights. And I'm also for equity, inclusion, and equity and inclusion, and justice, social justice. The problem is, it's it's easy to do rhetorically. But when you get down sociologically on the ground, the tensions between those value systems start to become manifest in real human behaviors. So that, for instance, somebody who comes to campus and gives a speech that some members of the community, because every college is a community of communities, and this was brought up in the last session, and that these communities are seen as safe places or spaces for people, and that's perfectly normal and a good thing. There are associations where people feel comfortable. But the way it might play out is somebody comes to campus and gives a talk that agitates or alienates or otherwise bothers a constituency of some other group that has historically been marginalized or treated inequitably. And there's complaints from members of that group that this speaker came and said these things that were offensive to me. Okay, so they're making a claim against the value of, not completely against it, but they're making a criticism of the value of freedom of expression. On the other hand, people who are free speech activists look to people who do that and say, they're trying to censor me. They're trying to shut me down. And that's where how the conflict is playing out on the campuses, you know, in real time, on the ground. You know, you have competing value systems that it's easy to agree with, that those things are good things to have in a community. But then when they actually are put into practice, you get real conflicts that emerge from people's different commitments to those sets of values. So the real tension that I'm trying to understand on campuses is the tension between free speech on the one hand and diversity, equity, and inclusion on the other hand, but also doing it from a strong position of being a free speech advocate, which leads me to having to decide, because I run a center, you know, which is supposed to invite speakers, not just because they're provocative and agitators and that kind of thing, but because they have different kinds of arguments. They're what I call orthogonal people. They're off the grid of their own field. They're thinking in brilliant and creative ways, but also contentious ways. Because I think my job as a teacher is, and this whole issue of is college a home? I'm not the parent. You know, my job as a teacher is to help sharpen thinking, sharpen critical thinking, to help people see things in different ways. And you can't do that unless you have maximal freedom of speech. Now, there's always the issue of how far you go, you know, in terms of who you invite. You know, John Stuart Mill says, well, if a person's idea is really, he doesn't say it this way, he says, but if a person's idea is really stupid, you know, you should let them speak so everybody can see how stupid it is. But by that logic, you might say, let's invite a KKK guy to come and talk about why he's a member of the KKK. And then everyone will see how stupid he is. The problem is, not everybody will see how stupid he is. They'll say, wow, you know, there's a guy that's fighting for white rights. You know, I never felt activated till right now, you know? And so obviously we don't invite those kind of people. But you know, the question of figuring out, you know, what the boundaries are to where other people feel unsafe is very difficult because you don't always know exactly who you're dealing with. So I could make Wellesley completely safe tomorrow. There could be zero harm, but that would entail not inviting anybody to speak. Because if I invite anybody to speak, it's guaranteed that that someone somewhere in the community is going to feel offended or harmed. And so I'm presenting this as a struggle, you know, with my own profession and my own self, which are intertwined, as to how to do that. And I do think that, you know, I'll stop. I only have 5 to 7 minutes, and I might have probably gone on too long. But I wanted to say you can when you're having a discussion about freedom of speech and then safe spaces and diversity and equity and inclusion, I think the most important thing to do as a starting point in a community is to what I call honor the counter value. You can disagree with it completely and think it's idiotic, but at least try to understand why that person holds that. I understand why African American students at Wellesley want to have particular kinds of associations, because Wellesley's Wellesley. You know, I know about Wellesley because Wellesley is a women's college that discriminates against people like me. No men are allowed to go there. Doesn't mean I'm suffering like somebody who has a historical legacy of marginalization, but I understand. But there's no men's support group at Wellesley, by the way. It's just we work there. But you know, I want to make sure that I'm understood on that score. That I understand that. I think the most important thing is to understand why people might be making a claim that they need to feel safe in order to then flourish as human beings. And I'll stop there. So.
Okay, so first of all, thank you all for having me. I've never been to Wake Forest before. And I have to admit, I got a little emotional when Melissa said Christina Greer is an associate professor. I met Melissa in 2003 when she was an assistant professor and I was a graduate student. I hadn't taken my comps yet. So it's been, yeah, well, I'm putting in fake gray hair just to offset the real gray hair. So I wanted to say thank you for that. And also, whenever I'm in a group of people, I always just encourage people to run for office. I mean, so many of these conversations actually are coming from a point of frustration that many of us have from our elected officials who we feel aren't speaking out or are speaking out in ways that are against our interests. So especially for the women in the room, I'm asking you all to think about it, right? At least, you know, it doesn't have to be president or senate or governor. It could be school board president, it could be city council, it could be mayor. We have, over 30,000 elected positions in this country, and we need more thoughtful people in those positions. So that's my little plug. So when Melissa asked me to participate in the free speech safe space, you know, this isn't really my wheelhouse. I write about race and ethnicity and immigration, but I do think a lot about power and privilege, and for me that's sort of at the root of some of this free speech conversation. And so as I was doing some research, because Thomas is essentially sort of the gold standard on many of these conversations, I printed off 30 to 35 articles just to really think about free speech and safe spaces, and I realized that the vast majority, 90 to 95%, were all written by white men. So I think it's also important for us, women in the room especially, to really write about safe spaces and free speech, because the conversation itself is actually being driven in a way that's actually not from a more widespread, diverse set of individuals. So we need more female voices. Also, does anyone here know what an HBCU is? What's an HBCU? Historically Black College and University. I've never gone to an HBCU. I've never taught in.
There's like 3 in town.
Right. So I always tell people that, you know, I went to Tufts, got my PhD at Columbia, worked at Smith, and now I'm a professor at Fordham. I always tell people that I went to and teach at an HWCU, which is a historically white college and university. Which means, and I think it's really important, because these universities were made for white people, white men in particular. So the same way that HBCUs were made to sort of uplift and teach black folks, all these other institutions were made to uplift and teach white men specifically. And as we integrate with women and people of color, international students, we're kind of the extra, but we're not the base category, which I find frustrating and troubling when we have these conversations about free speech, because we're not the dominant starting point. So everything is in response to what the institution has been set up to do, which is to educate and promote and uplift white men in a standard of safety, community, and intellectual space. And I might even argue, having taught at Smith, that that goes for women's colleges too, that there's a white male standard of what the baseline category is. So I still struggle with this conversation, because obviously I'm a little chatty like Melissa, and there are lots of people who call for me to get fired all the time. I'm like, that's what tenure's for. But I believe in free speech, right? And so, but there is a fundamental difference between free speech and hate speech and consequences of free speech. And so there's the university as this place where we exchange ideas versus this lack of willingness to see and hear others. And so that's kind of the undergirding of this conversation. Is the university becoming this walled off space where if you don't like the ideas, then you just shut down? But you're supposed to spend this 4 years as an intellectual tug of war to really challenge yourself and sort of pass beliefs, right? If not, you would be homeschooled from K through college, and you just stay with the opinion leaders who are your parents. That's not the point of college. And so I'm still torn, I have to say, as I've been thinking about these things. But as an institutionalist, someone who has been, essentially, I tell people I've been raised in captivity, right? I've been in institutions since I was 4 years old. I started in preschool, and then I went all the way through. And now I even work at the institution. So it's like we can talk about Stockholm Syndrome later. But I have chosen to be in this institution that is set up for a dominant space that actually does not include me. Right? What does that say about me? We'll talk about that in a different panel. But these places are not really built for non-white diversity. And so as more and more diversity in all different shapes and sizes, right? Class, racial, ethnic, sexuality, whatever it may be, sort of seep in. And we're never happy with the percentages. When I was at Tufts, it was 3.3%, right? But that's still more than the 0% that it used to be, right? Or the 1% of the entire university. And so there is this pushback of why are these people making us change and making me uncomfortable? Because essentially, we have to be honest that universities in many ways are still sort of bastions for kind of white male supremacy. Even though we have diversity with provosts and presidents and upper level leadership, the mission still struggles with a lot of schools. And again, whiteness as the base category. So we talked a little bit about words as assaults, and so the difference between sort of gathering as a group in person versus gathering on Twitter or Facebook. And one of the students last night at dinner made a really astute point where it's not really just about words anymore, because in this political moment especially, words are actions, and they quickly turn into actions, right? So it's not just, we were talking about this last night, I get a lot of hate mail, and it's always the N word plus the B word. And I do appreciate the intersectionality. I do appreciate it. I'm like, I am black and a woman, so thank you. But the N word and the B word, which sort of comes pretty quickly and from a large group of white men who email me or tweet me, is usually followed by raping and lynching, right? That's what needs to happen to you. And so there's the verbal, but then there's always this sort of threat of a physical. And I think we were lulled into this kind of, especially the Democrats, this kind of 8-year victory lap with Obama in the White House, while other people, I think, were sort of organizing, right? And really, really disappointed with the future and the direction and the sort of Negroizing of America, right? And what Obama exposed wasn't just Obama and his smart wife and sort of their double Ivies, it's the whole cadre of like super smart Black, Latino, Asian, Native people that they brought along with them in DC and across the country, which has shaken the core of American democracy, because that's not supposed to be us, right? We were a homogenous society as far as leadership is concerned, and so what does that then mean? We can talk about public versus private schools during Q&A, because I think that is a real different conversation, what private schools can do to sort of curtail and make all of their students feel good versus public schools, which is a little more complicated. I will say there is a fundamental difference, though, between being uncomfortable and putting students in a hateful and dangerous situation. I do think that, I believe that the KKK should be allowed to march, because I believe that the Black Panthers should be allowed to march too. So I think that that's fine. Carrying torches, which we know this country is completely ahistoric, carrying torches is a very specific thing, and it's a threatening visual for lots of people, right? Wearing t-shirts that say Jews won't replace us is a threatening thing to me. Some people just see it as free speech. But I see sort of the Charlottesville folks, the Milo folks, the Spencer folks, and the KKK folks, they're actually not the same. They're sort of cousins, but they have very sort of unique brands of white supremacy that I think to put them all in a bucket is irresponsible of us, because there's nuances to sort of the extent to which they translate their words into violence. And because we're in an era right now where white supremacy is being debated, right? So we have a president who's like, hey, both sides, right? We've always actually been at that moment. We've just never had a leader the President of the United States in the latter 20th century say these ideas are actually up for debate, right? They've always been around. These people, you know, they're 33, if not 40% of the country. And to say nothing of white women who support patriarchy, who uplift them to even higher numbers. So the president, though, saying that, like, we can actually have a debate as to whether or not white supremacy is a bad thing, is sort of thinking about the university as a microcosm of the larger United States, where people are having these same conversations just in this kind of smaller incubator, which brings up the question of, is college an incubator, right? I see it as like an incubator where I sort of give you nourishment and protection and knowledge before you're thrust out into the real world. But some of these issues you need to experience them before you go out into the real world, so you're not shocked like there are white supremacists. Let me boogie. So, safe space, few just kind of closing thoughts. I do believe in the right to free speech. I think that there are also consequences to the actions of free speech. So if you get punched in the face for saying hateful speech, I don't think that that's necessarily a horrible thing, Richard Spencer. I think lots of people will disagree with that, but I don't. I think at the base of this, though, we're looking at a moment in our country where it's blatantly obvious. This is what happens when the exercise of Reconstruction has never been completed. This is it. Like, where democracy also, the TikTok, like 250 years is, you know, swiftly approaching. But like, history matters, and we know that we're a country that doesn't respect history, right? And so when we see the mob violence in Charlottesville, people don't really make a connection to the mob violence in the 20s and 30s, where they burned down complete black towns and killed 60 people in a day and stole all of their money, right? And Ida B. Wells has to make the connection between lynching and finance, right? And so you're not just lynching a random farmhand, you're lynching the man who actually owns the store, right? And so these are things that, like, because we don't respect history as a nation, we're sort of unfortunately doomed to repeat some of these really horrible things yet again. And then we have silence, right? We had silence then and we have silence now. And so the silence is acquiescence, the silence is agreement, the silence is affirmation. And so I think this moment right now, we have to also ask ourselves what the silence means for ourselves and also for the people who are watching these things happen in these spaces. Last, I'll just say the ACLU, that might come up in Q&A in their defense of Charlottesville folks. If you're frustrated, I always just tell people ACLU is like awash in money, right? And so if you're frustrated with some of their stances, there are hundreds and hundreds of smaller grassroots organizations who are actually doing the work in their local towns. You actually don't have to give to the ACLU. You can actually give to people who are doing the micro work. So I'll pause right there so we can get started.
Thank you. So I want to pull together a couple of things that I heard and that are also part of the larger debate. Pose one really big question, one three-part question, a question in 3 parts, and then open it up. I appreciated, Tom, you beginning with a personal story and narrative, both because I thought, as we talked about a bit last night, when we're talking about thorny and difficult conversations, it is my belief that it is hardest to do when we are all strangers to each other, and becomes easier and easier the more that we are doing it in some kind of not just network but community, as Michael gave us the language for. The folks from Wake Forest know that I have been trying to do that in a community of folks, along with my SAPs, a community of folks called Wake the Vote. We try to do that as a residential college at Wake Forest in general, despite the fact that we are twice as large as when I went here 100,000 years ago. That part of what we make a claim towards as a residential university is that one of the things that might be possible in terms of rethinking community is that there may still be some value to going to college together on campus, because we can start to build some knowledge of each other, so that even when we roll our eyes because we don't agree with each other completely, we have some form of trust. So Lena Maxwell is here in the room, in part because I asked her to be here as our MC, because like Lena Maxwell is my movable safe space. And I'm sort of half joking about that, but quite genuinely, Lena and I have known each other for a very long time, and as she well knows, often when I am facing difficult and challenging conversations, it is useful and helpful to me to have Lena sitting there. She was there recently when I was in what we might call a triggering situation. Now, one of the things we often hear in the context of safe spaces, free speech conversation is, give me a trigger warning. And as both of us being sexual assault survivors, I am always a little bit like, how could I possibly give you a trigger warning? I don't know what your triggers are. My trigger might be a time of year. My trigger might be a smell. My trigger might be a certain person, right? We think of triggers as things that are racist or sexist or homophobic or someone saying we should kill Muslims. I mean, those are like hate speech. But as a sexual assault survivor, my trigger is a thing that you don't know anything about. So if I think I might be in a triggering situation, I take my movable safe space with me. I say that in part because I do worry that in talking about because I am much more a screw your safe space. I don't believe in safe spaces, but I certainly believe we have to make safe spaces. I believe in our capacity to do that for each other, to do it in community, not just in networks. But I'm not sure about, and I think that institutions have a responsibility to create institutional resources, but I think that we can talk about that separately from what happens as an intellectual and scholarly frameworks for analysis, right? Going back to what Jacob gave us. And one of the things that I appreciate that both of you suggested to us is that you struggle. And one of the things that I wonder if we could do is to talk about, and so I want to lay this out and do one more thing here as I ask the question. If part of what is difficult is that we don't openly struggle enough, that we pretend that there is no struggle in this conversation, that there's one position. And so, Christina, what I want to go back to and what you said was that all of this conversation seems to be happening from folks who have one identity. Now, the thing is, not all white guys are one identity, right? They actually, yeah, there's lots of fights in between, but that even within that, that we, right, I mean, not all white guys are the same, turns out. But I do, and this is the end of it, I do wonder if too much of this conversation is about students. I love y'all. But that ultimately, as Jacob said earlier, students come, they go, they pass through, hopefully, God help us, in a few years, 2, 3, 4, 6, 8, whatever. University of Chicago 15, but, sorry, UC joke. But the faculty are presumably here for some sort of lifetime. We govern the place. And that as we are talking about this question of being open to speech, being open to engaging ideas, that really the issue here is the potential anti-intellectualism, not of 18-year-olds, not of 20-year-olds, not of millennials, but of faculty themselves. The folks that we need to diversify. So when I heard you say, for 8 years, it seemed like there were some power changes. We changed it, we shook it up. No, we didn't. Faculties got whiter, more male. We haven't actually, the percentages of, for example, women of color in full-time tenure-track positions is not only leveled, it's declining. So I say all of that to say the most teachable moments, the opening up to ideas, the safety, the movable safety, the resources, I'm wondering if this conversation ought to be in part about not just sort of like diversity and equity and inclusion for students, but could we reframe this, explode this out a little bit and say, the folks we need to be challenging are us, the Tom Cushmans, the Christina Greers, the Melissa Harris Perrys. Should it be us that we're asking these questions of, not our kids?
So I'll start. I agree, definitely, right? I think that's a much longer conversation about the academic industrial complex where you have dinosaurs I mean, people who are pulling checks, they're not reading, they're not really great teachers, and they don't really care about the institution.
Oh, Lord, you're going to kill them all like Michael Dougherty last
Right.
night?
Yeah,
That's what happened at the end of dinner
let's
last
kill the
night.
baby boomers. I was like, slow down, my mom's a baby boomer. But I do think that's a real conversation to have, right? Because, yes, we know that as Obama's in office and this victory lap is happening, there are a lot of other institutional structures that we're really reversing and crumbling. We don't have many Black female full faculty members. I'm looking at one. I'm working on being another. Right, and so, but that's the key word, the pipeline too. And so many people get weeded out. People get weeded out as undergrads though, because of lack of mentorship, lack of Melissa Harris Perry saying, I think you're really smart and you should work for me and you should think about graduate school. Like, we know that it's a club and a lot of people, you know, they go to school and it's like, I gotta make money, I'm gonna be a lawyer or a pharmacist. Like, that's what my parents sort of talked about. I saw how much Wake Forest is. I know how much Fordham is. Like, this is not a game. So I think we have a problem with the pipeline. I do think that there's so many academics who are set in their ways, right? And they're the scholars. They know best, even though they have no idea what they're talking about when it comes to race, class, equity, gender, sexuality, whatever it may be. I'll say two things as someone who takes real pride in being an educator, right? I've chosen this profession. I've dedicated my life to this. This is what I do when I'm not with my friend's family and drinking wine, right? So it's like, it has to matter to me. So I always tell my students two things. One, you know, I quote Daniel Patrick Moynihan, which is, hey, we're diverse. So, you know, everyone is entitled to their own opinions, but you are not entitled to your own facts. And there are certain things that are facts, and we will have to agree with them as a collective, right? Like, this country is based on anti-Black racism and white supremacy. That's not my opinion. That's a fact. Like, and we can walk through it, and I'm gonna walk you through it, and we can talk about the Constitution as a living, breathing document and how we've evolved as a country, and I'm proud of it. However, the roots of this nation are on anti-Black racism and white supremacy. So the second thing I would say is I'm trying to learn, right? If we're educators, we should also be lifelong learners and listeners. And so when I think about, say, your example of triggering, there's so many, as a Black woman and how I embody myself, and I usually have an afro, and like there are lots of assumptions that are being made about me. And you know, when I teach race, I put these assumptions on the board, and they have to tell me which one is a lie, assumptions about me, and they have to tell me which one's a lie. I don't really care which one they choose, but they have to tell me why they think it's a lie, knowing nothing about me, right? Oh, you couldn't have played lacrosse. Why? So finally someone's like, because Black people don't play lacrosse. And I'm like, except for the top two Black lacrosse players in the country right now. Like, so these are things to just challenge our own assumptions. But what I'm trying to get a lot better at is that we carry so much physically, but there are a lot of things that people are carrying that we can't see. And so I thought about this because Fordham is where I teach is a vertical campus. And so everyone's always on the elevators. So from the lobby, people will hit floor 2. And I'm like, you people are too young to be taking the elevator, take the stairs. Like, this is so frustrating because it takes forever to get to the 9th floor, which is where I am. And then I thought about it one day and it was like, someone may not be able to take the stairs. They look just like me, but there's something that I don't see, right? Or maybe they like the comfort of the elevator, or maybe something happened in a stairwell where they won't take the stairs, right? And so like I really genuinely am trying to actually think about what Thomas said, sort of this honoring this counter value. So when I see my students in my class, I'm asking you not to make assumptions about me, so I'm not gonna make assumptions about you. You're, you know, a white boy from the Valley or whatever, and you have a blonde hair and you wear like a dirty baseball cap. First of all, no hats in my classroom. My mom's from the South. But it's like, I'm not gonna make assumptions that you're gonna be hostile to some of the lessons that I'm gonna put forward. Just because you're a Muslim immigrant, I'm not gonna make assumptions that you think America's great or not great, right? And so I think trying to put myself in the position of the people who are looking at me and some of the challenges. To be really honest, like I talk about the fact that most people have never had a Black woman in authority in front of them. Most white kids don't know a Black person who's not in some sort of service capacity to them. Right? So it's like, I'm not in a service capacity to you. Yes, you are paying for them, but I don't work for you, right? And so really making sure we can have these open conversations, because I'm not ashamed to be Black. I actually don't want to be anything but Black. Most people don't think that that's the truth, right? I think a lot of people assume that Black people want to be something other than Black. It's like, no, we're good. We're actually really great, actually. As hard as it is, like, we're actually really happy. And so like that is mind-opening to people. So really thinking about when we talk about these safe spaces, it's like defined by whom, When was it defined? And how can we consistently change it? And so I try and be honest. I'm not like super personal with my students, but I'm honest in a way where I essentially am breaking it down. It's like we're on a 4-month journey. It's going to be difficult. We have a baseline level of respect. I am the benevolent dictator. So it's like, but at the end of the day, I'm the captain. So I can set the tones and the norms. And like, I want us to have some space where we can push. But there's some ground rules as to how we push, right? And so yes, I may fundamentally disagree with some of these ideas, but how do I listen to your ideas? Because they're coming from somewhere.
Tom, do you want to?
Yeah, I do. I want to say a number of things. I think part of my critique of the rhetoric of safe spaces has not to do with the fact that sociologically they make total sense. They're civil associations. People join them for emotional and support reasons. But what's happened in some cases is that what's a perfectly understandable social phenomenon, and actually something I actually value, that people should join Americans join associations. You know, so Alexis de Tocqueville noticed that in the 19th century. He joined stuff all the time. You know, and they have this in the state, and it keeps them free. That's what he thought. But the part of my critique goes to how it's become ideologized. And what I mean by that is that it becomes part of a de facto type of knowledge that this is the truth of the world. And the real danger to thinking, and you mentioned anti-intellectualism, and the real danger to free thinking and to open thinking and dialogue is ideology. And the only thing worse than a right-wing ideologue is a left-wing ideologue. I mean, actually, let me rephrase. And the only thing worse than a left-wing ideologue is a right-wing ideologue. So in other words, ideologists are ideologists. And ideology, by its definition, is an anti-intellectual thing, because you let other people do your thinking for you. Somebody told me that, you know, Karl Marx wrote this book about class inequality, and I suffered from that, and I'm now a Marxist, and I just fall into line on that, you know, and, you know, an anthropology professor in grad school, I said, what's your politics? And he said, I'm a Marxist-Leninist. I said, why do you have to put Lenin in there? I mean, I can understand the Marx part, but Lenin, you know? But I say that because as brilliant as he was letting ideology more or less dictate how he looked at the world. So the struggle really is also against ideologies of all sorts, whether they're right-wing ones or left-wing ones, or, you know, that are not stated, at least, because the problem with ideologies is they tend to get stated in a kind of totalistic, absolutist way. This is the way the world works. They're not stated in the sense that I would tell my students, is like, the ground rules for my class are pretty simple. When we're speaking with each other, I could be wrong, you could be wrong, or we both could be wrong. Or on some things we could both be right. You know, and those are the ground rules. And it keeps it away from the ideological side. And I really want to stress that more than I can say. And I want to say one more word to go back a little bit about where we get our inspirations from. My inspiration for freedom of speech comes from Frederick Douglass. You know, this is an important year, so we're celebrating it at Wellesley College. It's the bicentennial year of his birth. Great classical liberal thinker, and he wrote a wonderful speech in Boston on freedom of expression. But in that speech, he also said people have the right to hear. And that, you know, freedom of speech shouldn't be shut down because other people have the right to hear what other people have to say. And that, what we're seeing a lot on campuses is some people saying, no, that person shouldn't be heard. And we get to define who that person is. And Douglass is also interesting, and I bring him up because, you know, in terms of when he hooked up with the abolitionist movement, they were using him symbolically as a slave, a former slave. And when they went on the road, all the white abolitionists said, you know, talk about what it was like. And he wrote about what it was like. And then he started to say, well, and I got a solution to the problem as well. And they said, Frederick, just stick to the narrative. We got this. And it was the white guys telling, and so this goes way back in American history, telling this guy, one of the great Americans ever, you know, that he couldn't actually, he was there just for one single purpose, to give the victim narrative, not to actually come up with the solutions. And then he wrote about that and said, what we want is our freedom, and then leave us alone. We don't need your help. You've not been helping us so far. To put it mildly, leave us alone. And that motif, I think, runs through African American intellectual life as well. Like, we don't necessarily need you to help us. We can do it on our own. And so I wanted to throw that in because I think it's very complex and historical about the fact that you can be inspired by somebody from a different racial or ethnic group because you're human, and because there's something trans-ideological, something supra-ideological that you connect with. And then these characteristics somehow recede a little bit. They never go away, and they're always important. But to me, it seems like a community must figure out ways for people who are different to be able to get along and trust each other. And this is what I studied in Bosnia after the war. The study was called Trust Relations in a Damaged Society. How could you get people, they live together fairly peacefully, integrated marriages, and then the next day, almost within days, turned on each other, and neighbors were killing neighbors, and trying to exterminate the other ethnic group. And somebody said, well, how are you going to get that society back on its? How are you going to get these people back into some kind of community? And I thought, well, if I could solve that problem, I could probably win a Nobel Prize or something, but because it's so intractable and such a sullen, difficult problem, But one thing I did notice is that I took a group of Muslim students over the mountain from Sarajevo into Pale, which was the capital of Republika Srpska. And they were very scared because we got in a cab and there was a picture of the Serb nationalist who was one of the architects of the genocide. I said, don't worry, you're safe with me. I know the language, and you won't do anything if I'm around. I was 36 then, so I felt a little more stronger. But we get to the other side, and there's a big festival, kind of Serbian festival going on. And I watched the students interact with the people. And what they were doing was economic transactions. They were buying cigarettes and other stuff. And there was no ethnicity present in the interactions. And so, what I said when I was consulted on this was create a situation in which there are what I call iterated interactions between people who have suffered at each other's hands or who are different. So for instance, in terms of building a community, it's really, what I mean by iteration is that you have one interaction and another interaction and another one, and after a while you can learn something about the subjectivity of that other person. You can literally empathize with them. In German, the word is einfühlen, which kind of means fall into the other. You can fall into them, but it takes a lot of hard work. It's like drilling hard boards. So the more we can do at a micro level to get people who are different talking with each other in iterated interactions, the more we can build something, not perfect harmony or perfect trust, but some kind of idea that, we're not really enemies. And I think, not to go on too long about this, but, I don't think universities, and this is based on going around to many of them all the time, I don't think they're the places where the real bad people are these days in the country. You know what I mean? What I'm saying is, like, obviously there's some, I know a little bit about the fraternity culture at Wake Forest because my daughter went here. I know a little bit about what goes on, but what I'm saying is that the idea that somehow universities are places that are unsafe for people. That's another problem with the term safe space is that it insinuates that all the other space is unsafe. I'm not saying they're perfect, but when we see what goes on in Charlottesville, or we see what goes on with the white supremacist movement, I mean, fortunately, I don't think most faculty in universities and campuses are affiliated with those movements, and I don't think most students are either. I mean, I'm not trying to be naive about that, but
I don't think that when people say safe space, they mean all the other spaces are unsafe, right? When people say save the Amazon, they don't say kill all the other forests.
Yeah.
They're just saying let's take a special look at this particular space, right? And so, I think Don Edwards' point made me really think about sort of how we replicate these kind of, quarantine spaces. But for some people in these institutions, and they're called institutions for a reason, right? Universities are institutions, prisons are institutions, religious places or institutions. Like they have these sets of norms and historical cultures where when people are sort of dropped in or placed in, there sometimes needs to be that extra buffer sometimes
I agree with that.
for integration or intellectual support, not just physical, but maybe intellectual. But I would say this, just on one thing, what's helping me at least be more generous to people of different ideas is I'm being a lot more deliberate with my language, which I feel is helping bring people into a conversation. For example, the word that I use, I've stopped using the word slave. Slave is like a table.
Yeah.
It's like a thing, an inanimate object. If I say an enslaved person, that sort of makes someone else think about the idea of slavery in a very different way, because that means it's not like someone's like, I'm just a slave, like I put these chains on myself. It's like, no, that is a part of a system and a series of individuals who've made choices to enslave another human being.
That's right. That's good.
Right? And so I think the breaking down of language helps breaking down of some barriers sometimes.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Right. We go on too long.
Are there folks?
Welcome to
who
Two
wanna-
Academics.
Are there folks who want, yeah. It's like asking the preacher to give grace, your food gets cold, yeah.
Hi, I'm Barry. I'm a grad student here. And we've talked a lot about how it's important to be uncomfortable and how free speech is a lot about talking with each other as well as listening to each other. But what do you suggest people do in situations where that's not necessarily as much of an option? For example, I've had a teacher who said they couldn't teach about something because they were scared of what the institution might say. But the NFL players scared of the owners. So what do you suggest doing about free speech in situations where employers are attempting to intimidate, threaten, or take legal action against people wanting to execute free speech?
Well, I just rambled on, so you can.
So
Yep.
I think they're similar but not the same, right? So I have my little I support Colin Kaepernick pin. Economics are real, and I think especially, let's just say we take the NFL. A lot of these people, we think they're making a lot of money. They're not making a lot of money. So this whole, like, I'm going to pay attention to my owner, meaning like words matter, right? So my owner says I can't kneel, and I'm not, right? Because everyone's like, they're making $900,000. And I'm like, yeah, before taxes, before their agent, before their lawyers, before all their other family members and sort of other circumstances. And it's like, and, NFL stands for not for long. So some of these people are not willing to jeopardize their precarious economic standing when their owners say that they can't do it. That's one piece. Academics, though, let's be clear. I was a lot more Chrissy Greer post-tenure, right? And which is why I think this conversation about getting rid of tenure in universities, there are people who have gotten tenure and it's like, you are a drain on resources, you need to go. But it also gave me a real freedom to sort of talk about certain things when all these other people are calling the provost and the president saying, she said America's based on anti-black racism, she needs to be fired immediately. And the provost is like, yeah, we're not, because those are her facts, right? So I don't see the two of those as the same per se.
I think also, I want to draw us back to something we said in plenary. So Dorian Warren brought us to the point of organizing. And we'll talk a little bit about this tonight on the sports panel. In fact, we'll talk a lot about this tonight on the sports panel. Dave Zirin, who is leading the sports panel, has a new piece out on thenation.com, if you go to it, where he talks about the fact that even though it looks like they're losing, the players who are protesting are winning. It's just a lot of what they're winning we don't see because it's happening in labor negotiations. So, and so they're not going to go out and they're not going to announce, we're winning, because that's just not how labor negotiations work. So part of how you become more powerful when you're dealing with a context of power disparities is to not be alone, but rather to organize collectively. So collective organization of those with relative less power tends to make free speech of those on the hierarchy easier to manage. So one of the things that we've been talking about here is as though all speech of all individuals is operating on the same level of the power hierarchy, right? And so obviously if one's speech is coming from the bottom of a circumstance with hierarchy, then you need more people together with you saying your speech in order to protect you. Because if it's just one person speaking and that person has power, privilege, money, resources of the state, then they're more capable of projecting their voice, their speech, their words, without necessarily all of those protective tools around them. So that's sort of one part of the answer. Tenure is part of what kind of tips that scale, for example, and sort of creates a different level or power of relationship. But it's also, so for me, part of why it's difficult for me to hear anything other than like a pretty strong free speech discourse within the context of universities, because after all, we operate in a system where ideally faculty are making a claim towards professionalized tenure as the key to what we want. And so to make a claim towards anybody else not having also the power to speak when it is the thing that we are claiming we need and want, right? It's tough for me to make a claim towards like, I need anything other than that for my main professional life goal, but you shut up, right? So it's why I tend to fall pretty strongly on the free speech side, even though I recognize that it can be a fairly painful space, but it's therefore why I think we have to marshal resources for folks who have fewer resources when they're wanting to speak. So free speech means free speech for everybody. So just real quick, Alana James last night was saying, did I see Alana in here? She was in here. Oh, there you are. Right, she was saying, so you can speak, but then speech has consequences. So you come here and you're like, you ain't no good, you gay, Muslim, brown person, and guess what we gonna do? All us gay, Muslim, brown people, we gonna get together and we gonna speak back. You know what? Bleh! So because we gonna have the free speech too. So everybody gonna be free speeching to each other. Now nobody's gonna like throw, fire. But we're going to throw words, sir, because, oh, you got words? Me too. Right? And she said it much more reasonably. But it's just the point that, like, speech has consequences. You got a hashtag? Me too. How about that? Oh, you gonna send some hate? I'm going to retweet that. Now, go get them, trolls. Ha-ha. Hotep, get them. Teacot, let's go. Right? So, like, that's part of what you do, right? So it's not just you have free speech rights. We going to all have them up in here together. Let's go free speech. And so that's like, I want to like squad deep, let's roll. Your ideas ain't, I'm not afraid of your ideas, I got ideas, let's go. Oh, you got facts, I got alternative facts, let's go, Kelly, let's go. Right, so, because like I want you to buck up with speech, I want you to buck up with ideas, let's go, let's read some books. I'm not afraid of your ideas, bring them. So, like, let's go, yeah, right, okay. Yes, Diana Gray.
Because one of the things that's interested me is what's going on in the social media, Twitter and Facebook and everything. And a lot of people have been viciously attacked in social media. And I read an interesting book by John Ronson, So You've Been Publicly Shamed. And it's about people who have misstepped, sometimes in really awful ways, and others in minor ways, but the consequences of the pile on social media on these people have lost them their jobs, lost them their income, disgraced and shamed them in ways. In fact, he went back talking about how we used to pillory people, put them in public square, and it's like that in a social media way. And yet social media also gives us a voice for freedom of speech and for talk back. And so it's complicated. Yeah. But he concluded the book by saying we are defining the boundaries of morality by tearing apart the people outside of it. Well, it's outside of it as groups of people define morality. What you did or what you said was inappropriate and unaccessible, and you are now going to be publicly punished for it. And everybody piles on, and then they go their way, and most people that have had this happen to them have not survived very well through it. So I know this is kind of academic focused here, and is the academy supposed to provide a safe place where you don't, trigger people for things you don't know? Or are you going to be open and allow the ideas to flow, and then maybe have some kind of system of support for people that get triggered so they don't fall apart? But I had that happen in a meeting the other night where people were just rang each other. They each had points of view. Some were defensive, others were attacking. Nobody really moderated that. And so part of that seems like if you're going to bring in other points of view, you need to provide the safe space by how you moderate it, or by how you police the demonstration, or things like that. So it's complex. There's a lot of things to think about. But I just wanted to open up the social media.
Can I just say quickly to that? I mean, one of the ways, if I invite a speaker who's right of center, maybe a conservative intellectual who writes books and is a professor, my colleagues will say, you need to have somebody on a panel to counterbalance his view, to give balance. But never will a left-wing professor invite somebody on the left and then say, in order to be fair and pluralistic and tolerant, we should have somebody on the right to counter that view. Never. So there's a double standard in that sense on campuses, it seems to me.
Wow.
Where that comes from, is a complicated story. It has to do with the ideological closure. It's not really about the social media, but it's about the issues of balance. And maybe that I didn't address your question at all. Social media changes things dramatically. And it's not true that shaming always has adverse effects. I mean, some of the opponents of what I do have done that to me, and it's only strengthened my hand. Because people say, so it doesn't always happen that way.
Sure. I will say that, as we heard, I think particularly we know that for women on social media, and particularly for women of color, for queer folks, that the effects of, and I think often also for anonymous folks. So I think one of the most horrendous stories is the young woman who was just sort of no one, but she tweeted something, racially insensitive on her way to South
I'm going
Africa.
to Africa. I hope I don't get AIDS.
Yeah, I'm going to
turned
Africa.
off
I
her
hope I
phone.
don't get AIDS. But she was just like a person. And then by the time she gets off the plane, she's lost her job and her life. And it's not the best thing. Not the best thing to write. Don't write that. Don't tweet that. That's not the best thing to tweet. It's just not. But not also really clear that she should lose her whole job and life. And, whoa.
I think this
too
is,
much.
This
Officially
is where,
too much. Social media.
Trump tweets all kinds of
Oh well, we okay. Okay, well we're not gonna do President Trump today, Mama. Y'all, that's my mama.
Thank you.
Y'all, that's my mama. So I'm about to moderate the hell out of my mama. We're not doing Trump.
Thank you.
but I will
I
say,
love you, Mama. We're not doing Trump right now. We're not doing what Mr. Trump does not does.
Right.
No, sir. Not today.
But Melissa, I will say the role of the faculty member is, a lot of, I did not grow up, when I was in grad school, we didn't have the interweb, right? And so this is you young people are just growing with a whole new life that I didn't have. And so I remind them though, I'm like, whatever you tweet, whatever you post, assume that one day at some point in your life, it'll show up on the front page of the New York Times above the fold.
Yeah, but that's over now because President Trump is president, so it'll be fine.
Right.
So it'll all be fine. One last question. Oh, two last questions. We're going to do.
We'll be brief. We won't, we won't be professors.
In the back and then in the front. Yes.
Cut the same cloth.
I really appreciated the comment about honoring the counter value so that we can understand the why of people. But I wonder about the role of honoring the 100% humanity of the other people. And I know we don't have time to discuss it, but I think, how can I discuss this with you when you don't think that I am 100% human like you?
Yes.
So I just want to put that out there.
That's tough. No, that's real.
Because free speech, the definition changes depending on the assumptions of how human I am.
But don't people on the margins constantly have conversations with people who don't think they're human? And we just,
Well, isn't part of community really about the affirmation of the dignity of the other as human? And that's the real problem of history, is that that's just not how it works on the ground. You know, historically, it's that people classify each other all the time, and that's how it, and then act based on those classifications. You know, is that something that's always going to be with us? You know, some people, historians would say, well, the evidence is pretty strong that people are always going to classify and harm people based on those classifications. And we can try as we might, but something will kick in and they'll continue to be. That's a very pessimistic view of history. And the optimistic one is that you can make people see the dignity and the humanity of the other if they don't. And it's interesting to read, say, accounts of people who have been, you know, in white supremacist movements, who have defected from the movements, and write memoirs about what happened to them. And you know, I don't know, they're not, they may be just trying to make money, I don't know, but their autobiographies of how they came to see other people as human when they were raised not to see other people as human.
And that goes back to your point about ideologues. It's usually when they have a moment of agnoresis and they actually wake up, right? But I think, going back to, I'm defending Mama now. I think going back to Mommy's point, which was we had a veneer for a long time of at least the latter 20th century, early 21st century, a relative veneer where we would at least engage, where I would pretend that your humanity mattered. When you have a president who says it doesn't, and or it's up for debate, that has like freed a lot of people to say what they weren't allowed to say before, which is like, I actually don't think you should exist, full stop.
now see, you're gonna make me turn this into not a safe space, Chris Greer. Because I just don't buy it. I don't buy it, and I ain't, see, now because it's 12 o'clock and people got free box lunches downstairs, but no ma'am, no ma'am, that's not Trump's fault. Trump's on the back end of the equation, and on the front end, he is a dependent variable, not an independent variable, ma'am.
I'll give you
and
that.
look.
I think he operates as both.
Look, all I'm gonna say is this, and then I'm gonna let you ask your question, and we're gonna be on out of here. But I appreciate and prefer living in the country, and find it fascinating. Fascinating and enjoyable, and
when the veneers are off?
No, not when the veneers are off. I am just into it when I wake up on a day and just every white guy on TV is like, I'm against white supremacy. And I am just saying that never happened when President Obama was president. And the shit is wild. And I'm into it. And like, I mean, it now only happens to Trump. Every white Republican in the country was like, white supremacy is wrong. And you know, and I know that they didn't even used to say that white supremacy existed in the present tense. And just, I mean, the little dude from Colorado who wants to be president, who looks like a Republican Jeb Bartlett, just got on the TV, and he was like Cory Gardner, and he got the little all of Colorado behind him, and he was like, white supremacy is wrong, and if Trump don't say, and I mean, it's wild, and you know it, and it wasn't Trump that freed all this up, it was Obama, and you know it. And it's not Obama's fault, it was just because he was black and walking around in the White House for 8 years, and that is the main thing that just liberated all the white supremacy. And Trump is the back end of the equation, and we're not gonna do this right now. And see, that's your fault, and stop.
Sorry,
doing my thing.
Mommy, I was trying to stick up for you. I was trying to do it. Okay. Well, we'll do this offline.
Yes. Ma'am, and I'm gonna cancel your plane, you're gonna drink wine and stay, yes. See what happens when you invite your friends and your mom comes to the conference and it's out of hand. That's why this ain't being live streamed, yes.
My question is in response to the universities as not a safe space. A lot of the demonstrations and speeches that have been occurring on universities. So for people that are black like me or queer like me or Muslim or what have you, how do you preserve safety of space or even just presence of mind for students that really don't feel safe in those spaces? And what is the university's responsibility in making sure that they can still function as reasonable people while kind of faced with this forefront of oppressive speech and language?
Right, like how do we keep our mission as an institution relevant when so many of our students are doing so much emotional labor just to survive, right? Like, yeah.
Yes.
I've heard that before, you know, the emotional labor to survive. I mean, it's always the question was brought up in the panel before about tolerance, and which is so hard. You know, the Latin root means to bear, and there's a critique of that liberal idea of tolerance, which says, well, it's easy for people who have power and privilege and are white and have the history of that to say you have to be tolerant, you know, because they've controlled the discourse for so long. But I think it gets down to a kind of public-private kind of a thing. This gets to the point that was made earlier. Public institutions are bound by the First Amendment in ways that private ones aren't. So, you know, I don't know why people invite Milo and Spencer and all these people. I mean, they're just, they're not helping. They're not creating what I think is a civil association. You know, so I work at a private school, and technically we're not bound by the First Amendment, but there's language in our charter that says if you come here, you're guaranteed the right to speak. So if your right to speak were violated, you could sue the college. So you have to go to you have to go to a tort case in order to take action at a private place. But I don't think you can protect everybody from harm. I think what I like to think of is tactics of resistance. So, you know, what do Jews do when Nazis march through Skokie? Does anybody know? They go to the parade and they turn their backs and pray or talk to each other or say, we're stronger than them. They're morons. And, you know, is that a good solution? You know, it's one type of solution, and I am totally against this snowflake coddling kind of thing, because people really do feel that if somebody shows up and makes, like Spencer shows up and makes his arguments, they really do feel threatened by that. And I go back to the story about my wife. You know, she really does feel threatened. So I know that's very real. So I don't know how to solve the problem except by, in my case, I can get off by saying it's just exercise good judgment and do your advice and try to structure it in a way that's inclusive so that people can come and hear different points of view and, you know, lay some ground rules and, you know, without being totalitarian about it, and just kind of, and it kind of works actually. I mean, some of the most controversial speakers we've had, you know, people show up loaded for bear, you know, and they blast away at the speaker, and then, you know, at the end they clap, and, you know, and they go up and talk. They totally disagree with the speaker, but, you know, the speaker was within the bounds of reason, you know, and that's where the work of the professor comes in, or other members of the community. So I asked students, well, how could we structure this event so that some students wouldn't be so alienated? And that's the beginning of a longer story, but I appreciate you asking that question. It's,
the truth is, when it comes to the speaker, like the speakers are usually pretty like garbage. Like, I mean, the truth is, like, they're usually kind of like, I mean, just if you're talking about speakers coming to campus. So it's got to be something else that you're talking about.
More so like demonstrations. So like I went to Carolina, I graduated 2 years
Yeah.
ago, and KKK came and they were protected by
Okay,
the
right, so
police.
that's a different thing, right.
So just demonstrations or people that come and kind of have this speech.
Yes,
is harmful
right.
and don't work.
Right. Okay. So, because like speakers coming to campus are usually just like, come on now. They're just like the most inflammatory are also usually the easiest
Yeah.
in that they're like.
yeah, that's right. That's right. She's absolutely right. Yeah.
But like, yes, right. The Klan marching through your campus is a different situation, right? Mm-hmm. And so then you need tactics of organizing, and then you're in the struggle, and the struggle is exhausting and endless. Yep.
Can I ask you one question, just very simply? Isn't it okay to ask people to do emotional labor? I mean, I don't know how I want to do that. I mean,
So you're
life.
right, but you're asking about a university as part of a community that is right. And so what I would say is, I think universities have responsibility as part of larger community. Here we're going to go to lunch.
Yeah, sorry.
So, because what I want to do is I have a responsibility as moderator to let folks go to lunch. But this is a question that I think continues as part of, and I'm going to say this. I also want you to pose that question if you're coming to the 1 o'clock. So Steve Diner, who is our 1 o'clock keynote, his whole work has been universities are not just like schoolhouses sitting on a corner. That what universities do is they ought to be primarily engaged with the cities where they are located. So I also want you, and I'm moderating that panel after he has this conversation with Colleen Flaherty. If you raise your hand, I would love for you to pose that specifically to our 1 o'clock speaker. During the time that he was chancellor at Rutgers in Newark, it was the most racially diverse U.S. campus for every year that he was chancellor by U.S. News and World Report, the number one during the entire time. He started his career writing about the University of Chicago and then ended his administrative career as chancellor there. That is what he does. And I think that he will have profoundly informed professional insights on exactly that question. And I would really like to know what Steve Diner has to say about that question. I'd really, really like to hear the answer to that. So I would love it if you would pose that.